of a single market and economy will remain but a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. It is said, Mr. Speaker, that to the credit of CARICOM heads of government, they have recognized the imperative and laid out an architecture of critical institutions and legislative and administrative arrangements to be put in place to enable it to work. Mr. Speaker, I highlight this because when decisions are taken and timelines are set, and the timelines come and go, and the actions to be taken are not taken, the goals to be achieved are not achieved, then it begs the question as to whether continued investment makes sense and what else needs to be done. So, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, heads adopted an implementation program developed by the late Professor Norman Gervin that itemized the actions required to bring the CSME into full operation. And this was to be accomplished in 2 phases over the periods 2006 to 2008, and then 2009 to 2015. And here we are in 2018. Mr. Speaker, what has actually been accomplished, the report finds, has fallen far short of even modest expectations and varies both among member countries and across the range of actions that were to be taken. It is said that it must be acknowledged that some valuable work has been done, albeit tediously, in putting in place some of the legislative provisions and institutional arrangements. And the Prime Minister spoke to some of what we have done in this jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, it is said, though, that there are still huge gaps to be closed, and many of the provisions vital to the creation and functioning of the CSME have received little or no attention, and it is what is often referred to as CARICOM implementation deficit. Mr. Speaker, just by way of highlight, the ability of CARICOM nationals to move freely throughout the community has remained a vexed issue, and it has been raised by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. But the report identified in this regard, in respect of free movement of people, that only 10 categories of workers are currently entitled to work throughout the region without work permits. Other CARICOM nationals are entitled up to 6 months stay, but are not entitled to seek employment. Only Jamaica, Guyana, and Grenada to date recognizes all 10 agreed categories of workers. Some member states require certified workers to apply for a separate skill certificate in the country where they seek employment before being entitled to work. A police certificate, Mr. Speaker, which is totally irrelevant to one's level of competence, is required before a skill certificate can be issued. In some member states, spouses and dependents of certified workers are not allowed indefinite leave, indefinite stay, as was mandated. Business owners exercising the right of establishment are required to obtain work permits, a precarious basis on which to commit investment in a country. The long-discussed protocol on contingent rights to ensure non-discriminatory access to social services by dependents of CARICOM nationals legally entitled to live and work in member states other than their own is not yet in place. It is noted, Mr. Speaker, that in a submission to the Commission from a member of the public who was employed in Barbados, as the public report has stated, related the difficulty in having his children enrolled in both primary and secondary schools, being required each year to produce a school permit from the Immigration Department, as well as a letter from the school principal certifying that they were not occupying the place of a national. While the CARICOM Agreement on Social Security ensures portability for government schemes such as the National Insurance Scheme, the absence of similar arrangements for private pension schemes serve as an impediment to the free movement of CARICOM nationals within the region. Mr. Speaker, we're highlighting decisions taken, actions that should have been done, not yet done. In respect of, Mr. Speaker, the report highlights a number of other areas, including harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operation of business, market service, look specifically at the right of establishment, a number of other areas. But Mr. Speaker, the work says that they consider some of those issues to be make or break issues that will determine whether the goal of a single market and economy is worth pursuing or whether we are simply flogging a dead horse. Mr. Speaker, the report also notes that approximately 35,000 Jamaicans travel annually to other CARICOM countries. Jamaicans travel daily to other CARICOM countries, not only for tourism, but also to exercise the right of establishment and to provide services. In its groundbreaking decision in the Shanique Myrie case, the Caribbean Court of Justice held that the entry and stay of a CARICOM national in another member state should be hassle-free. That is to say, without harassment or the imposition of unnecessary and unreasonable impediments. The Myrie decision, Mr. Speaker, underscores that the freedom of movement does not only relate to a right of entry and the absence of visa requirements, but also to the standard of treatment meted out to CARICOM nationals when they enter the territory of another CARICOM state. Mr. Speaker, at the last meeting on April 13th of this year, the Legal Affairs Committee considered several matters impacting on freedom of movement of CARICOM nationals. And the committee considered whether Haitian nationals are entitled to automatic stay of 6 months upon arrival in CARICOM member states, the procedure on the refusal of entry of CARICOM nationals, and whether the requirement of a police certificate of character in the skills application and verification process constitutes a breach of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Mr. Speaker, these are matters that are included on the agenda of the Legal Affairs Committee because of the priority treatment that is required. And you know, Mr. Speaker, when one talks about priority treatment and notes that it was in 2007 that the Conference of Heads took the decision that all CARICOM nationals should be entitled to an automatic stay of 6 months upon arrival in order to enhance their sense that they belong to and can move in the Caribbean community, subject to the rights of member states to refuse undesirable persons entry and prevent persons from becoming a charge on the public purse. One really wonders how much longer can we wait to say, let us see whether the decisions taken are going to be implemented. Mr. Speaker, if member states are not committed to ensuring at the operational level that hassle-free movement can be achieved, it will significantly undermine one key pillar of the regional integration that CARICOM is intended to secure. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, this debate is so important. That is why it's also important that as a parliament, we come to some common ground on the action or the signal that the government of Jamaica should send, clearly and unequivocally. Mr. Speaker, I will deal just very briefly with the original jurisdiction of the Caribbean community and the dispute settlement mechanism before I take my seat. As stated in the report, the issue of Jamaica's relationship with the Caribbean Court of Justice beyond its original jurisdiction, to which Jamaica has already acceded, was specifically excluded from the mandate of the Commission. And, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that, there is yet to be some concurrence between the two sides on Jamaica's accession to the appellate jurisdiction of the CCJ. However, in its original jurisdiction, the Caribbean Court is an international court, applying the rules of international law to settle disputes concerning the interpretation and application of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. It must be noted, Mr. Speaker, that the decisions of the CCJ in its original jurisdiction have had a significant impact on the development of the CARICOM single market and economy. Cases brought against the community have caused an examination into issues related to collective responsibility for decisions made by organs and bodies of the community, the consultative and decision-making process, and reporting of decisions. Mr. Speaker, for example, the court's guidance in the Trinidad Cement Limited, TCL and CARICOM case has led to changes to the procedure for application for suspension of the Common External Tariff, the CET. Additionally, the community amended Article 83 to provide the quoted with greater flexibility in the grant of suspensions following a more narrow interpretation of the Article 83 suspension regime by the court. The court in TCL also underscored the importance of member states undertaking the relevant consultations in a timely fashion at the national and regional levels with all relevant parties in the public and private sectors and across civil society. Mr. Speaker, the Shanique Myrie decision mentioned earlier has led to continued review by member states of their administrative procedures in relation to freedom of movement, and to ensure that additional restrictions have not been placed on nationals seeking to exercise their right as service providers and establishment owners. And Mr. Speaker, what really is cause for concern is just the length of time it takes to implement decisions or to do what is required to achieve the goals that are set. The Review Commission has recommended that CARICOM nationals and corporate entities should be allowed to avail themselves of the dispute settlement processes of the treaty in their own right without having to depend on their governments to pursue the matter on their behalf. But in this regard, Mr. Speaker, I should point out very briefly that Article 222(c)(2) of the treaty already gives natural and legal persons the right to appear as parties before the court, where they have been granted special leave of the court. The intended party would have to demonstrate that, one, a right or benefit conferred by or under the revised treaty on a contracting party inures to the benefit of such a person directly. Two, the person has been prejudiced in respect of the enjoyment of such right or benefit. Three, the state entitled to espouse the claim has omitted or declined to do so or expressly agreed that the person concerned may espouse the claim instead. And four, the interests of justice require that the person be allowed to espouse the claim. Mr. Speaker, I highlight this recommendation and point out what is provided for in the treaty, not only to clarify the matter, but to say that we will have to consider whether the right of access requires further expansion and the process by which we would do that. Mr. Speaker, finally, I turn to the dispute settlement issue. I crave your indulgence, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Review Commission was also charged with the task of assessing whether the CARICOM dispute settlement provisions provide realistic options for settlement of disputes for Jamaica. The Commission rightly noted that the provisions in the revised treaty for dispute settlement are fragmented, and in many instances, the processes are inconclusive. For example, Mr. Speaker, some organs of CARICOM do not have the power to issue directives or apply sanctions to member states found to be in breach of the treaty. And in this regard, the Commission had a specific recommendation. It proposes a resolution of the governance dilemma through amendment of the Treaty of Chaguaramas. And we recognize that it would require an inordinate amount of time and considerable consultation among both heads and their advisors. But, Mr. Speaker, the recommendation is designed to seek to compel member states to give effect to rights and obligations arising from community law within a time frame to be specified. And we know, Mr. Speaker, that there's nothing so unnerving to have processes go on and on without no end in sight. So the process would include the formulation of a body of sanctions for willful non-compliance or flagrant breach of said law. Mr. Speaker, in considering the recommendation, the discussion recognized that it would be naive to believe that the objective will be easily achieved without the requisite political will. But I think more than anything else, Jamaica, as Prime Minister has indicated, will not shy away from broaching the issue in our caucus consultations in July, because it is a matter that has to be addressed, and it underscores the need to have this conversation, to have this discussion, and for us to determine once and for all where we are going. In the interim, Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that there are a range of existing provisions in the treaty which already speak to such issue, but which have not been effectively utilized thus far. In fact, the implementation of the revised treaty by CARICOM member state confers an implied obligation on all states to respect decisions taken by bodies and organs in the community. And if one looks at Article 9 of the treaty, you would see that it constitutes that all member states should take all appropriate measures to ensure the carrying out of obligations arising from the treaty or resulting from decisions taken by the organ and bodies in the community. And Article 20, 242 also lends support in that regard, because it requires member states to expeditiously transform decisions of organs of the community into domestic law. I won't be much longer, Mr. Speaker.
Members' time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time be extended sufficient to enable her to complete her presentation. This is going to be the format because I think this debate today is so important that we exercise a degree of flexibility.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mrs. Malawuford.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it is important that we examine the recommendations against the challenges that we have faced. I note that the recommendation or the suggestion of the leader of the opposition is that they share the view that the time, as he had put it in his presentation, for so-so chat has come to an end. And we can't talk our way through the problem. And he has indicated that this Golding report provides a good template. And his recommendation is that it is to be treated as a beginning and not the end. He acknowledges that it is serious work and proposes that a CARICOM review committee with a Golding report as its template should be established. Speaking for myself, Mr. Speaker, I believe that it is a suggestion that is worthy of consideration. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, there are vexed issues on which decisions have been taken, but no action has come, or the action has not come in a timely way. And CARICOM nationals have been frustrated in the process. You would note that there was a recommendation in relation to voting rights, for example. And Article 27.1 is clear about granting member states who sit on organs and bodies of the community the right of a vote. The only exception to that right is provided in Article 27.2 in cases where member states fail to pay their contributions to the budget of the community for periods exceeding 2 years. And in this case, member states are only allowed to vote on CSME matters. It should also be noted that before that, the loss of voting right has not effectively served as a major deterrent, since Article 27.2 allows member states who cannot vote to engage in the deliberations before the decision is made. And this has often allowed a member state the opportunity to influence the vote. So, Mr. Speaker, just highlighting this, that, the arrangements are so loose. The arrangements have no sanctions. And those who should do what they are mandated to do and don't do it still have a say. And at the end of the day, there is so much frustration. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap my presentation. But I invite all members to look at it to the extent that we celebrate and take pride in our Caribbeanness, and to the extent that we hail regionalism as still worthy of pursuit, that there are serious problems to be addressed. And if we agree, Mr. Speaker, that regionalism is still worthy of pursuit, then we can't sit back and look at how the Caribbean community has worked and not endorse the recommendation that the Prime Minister, on assuming the chair of Conference of Heads, should not put to his colleague heads a position that time has come for us, once and for all, to take stock of where we are. Set a time frame. Time frames have been set, they have not been met. But once and for all member states have national priorities that require much time and attention. So to the extent that we continue to embrace the regionalism, time has come, Mr. Speaker, for action that will yield more positive results for Jamaicans and the Caribbean people. May it so please you, Mr. Speaker.
Ms. Hannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in the 1990s, there was a great song called Rally Round the West Indies by David Rudder. And at the time, even though he was responding and speaking about West Indies cricket, it was a satire on how all of us in the Caribbean would act in terms of a divided world. And Rudder was very clear that in a divided world, it would appear that they don't need tiny states, tiny islands, and that somehow we were doomed. But he goes on to say that little keys can open mighty doors. And so, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to make my contribution to this debate. Back in July 2016, when the Most Honorable Prime Minister Andrew Holness appointed the CARICOM Review Commission, chaired by the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, it was a time when all of us were very excited about the possibilities of the report. In March 2017, when the Commission submitted its report to Cabinet, was some time after. And then 15 months later, this report is finally being debated in what appears to me to be somewhat of a deliberate haste, perhaps to mask the government's tardiness on a number of issues. Mr. Speaker, CARICOM is critical to Jamaica's long-term future, and it has strategic implications to our business and private sector industries. It really would have served us well if we had solicited comments from a wider group than this Parliament. The people of Jamaica and certainly the region deserve a lot more in terms of our deliberations. I believe that this somewhat untidy and mediocre approach to our foreign policy deliberations seem to be our modus operandi, and we're accustomed to Jamaica not abrogating its responsibility in this manner. However, may I respectfully urge the Prime Minister to change this reality on the eve of Jamaica's ascension to the chair of CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, 8 years ago, the heads of government concluded in 2010 that a review of the CARICOM Treaty was necessary and mandated that an intergovernment task force be established for that purpose. That process has hardly progressed. I want to pause for a minute to examine what has actually happened globally over the last 8 years. The world economy has since recovered from what was deemed the Great Depression since 2008. The price of oil rose from $71 in 2010 to $91 and then fell back in 2013 to $36. China's economy has grown by over 65% since 2010. Britain has voted to exit the European Union, and our major trading partner in the North has unilaterally changed established rules of free trade. Mr. Speaker, while the world has been moving rapidly, CARICOM has maintained a lackluster enthusiasm towards its stated objectives of a single market and single economy. The questions before us, as outlined by this Golding Commission report, is 1, do we stay in CARICOM or Jexit? 2, if we are to stay, do we participate politically and economically, or just politically as members? And 3, what shape should CARICOM take moving forward? Mr. Speaker, I found the report instructive and comprehensive, and I really want to congratulate the team involved for their work and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for overseeing that team. In my own deliberations, I went and sat with Mr. Bruce Golding, who made it very clear that at the time, and the time then as it is now, is for heads of government in the region to act and take personal responsibility for ensuring that the organs of CARICOM actually work. They need to strengthen the Secretariat's financial and operational work, engage the region's private sector, and review the entire intra-regional trade arrangements within the structure. Mr. Speaker, the report is hinged on Jamaica's recommending 33 overall solutions for the CSME, some of which require amendment to the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas of 2001. And as it states, and I quote, Jamaica should seek a clear, definitive commitment by all member states to a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill all its obligations and complete all requirements for CSME to be fully established and operational within 5 years, failing which Jamaica should pull out of the economic arrangement but remain a member, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, it's not my approach this afternoon to deliberate and deconstruct each and every recommendation the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister has put forward our position. Certainly on our side, the Leader of Opposition has put forward his position, which takes into consideration what we're proposing, and the Prime Minister has put forward the government's position. I am more concerned with the general direction and thrust that the Commission report takes. It is my view that Jamaica should never leave CARICOM, Mr. Speaker. The time to stay together is more urgent today than ever before. This is our family. We're bonded together by a common history, similar cultures. Most of our economies are largely dependent on tourism. We're all susceptible to the ravages of climate change. That is why when Barbados experiences IMF problems and Antigua is hit by a hurricane, we can all empathize. Most importantly, though, Mr. Speaker, in a global environment where principled positions are being reversed and eroded daily in deference to might is right, smaller countries with smaller economies, with small populations, are better off standing together rather than standing alone. We cannot expect larger economies to protect us when they're more concerned with staving off imminent trade wars and impose sanctions to the movement of their own goods and services. We must build our strength in staying and working together. It is not by accident that the United Kingdom is seeking engagement of the Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean for trade in partnership. Mr. Speaker, 1 from 10 must never again in our history equal 0. But there are some glaring realities we must confront for our own economic survival and growth. Our data, and certainly the data in the report, confirms that the single market economy has not worked in Jamaica's best interest and the free movement of our labor. And that remains something that is of concern, I think, to everybody in this Parliament. The report confirms the minimal economic impact of the CSME on Jamaica. Of the 12 countries in CARICOM, Jamaica's regional trade as a percentage of our total exports is the lowest at 3%. Given our very limited supply of exportable products, Jamaica's beneficial and principal benefit would come from the free movement of labor within the region. Regrettably, the regional governments have been slow and unwilling to act more positively in this direction. Mr. Speaker, I want to suggest that government should concentrate on what they know best, namely creating policy, and let the private sector, as envisaged in the report, lead the debate in respect to trade. As leaders, we should ensure that there is a level playing field for all our goods and services to compete, while aggressively reorienting our economy to being internationally competitive in the products that we make. Before we give trade ultimatums to others, our government must first develop a progressive export policy. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica does not have an effective export policy. We have fragmented agencies and groups within the same given different mandates: JAMPRO, the Economic Growth Council, a Ministry of Economic Growth, and several other ministries. But I have not been able to locate our policy dedicated to our exports, one that is rationalized in the context of today's realities. Mr. Speaker, import substitution is not the answer to economies of scale or cost competitiveness. Neither should we continue to manufacture everything under the sun. We must manufacture those items for which we have international competitive markets. We're better off, Mr. Speaker, being a world leader in a few products than being known as manufacturing samples in everything. Until we reorient our own economy to be competitive in the global marketplace, it is unlikely that we will be competitive in the CSME. It is inconceivable to acknowledge that right here in Jamaica, if we want to ship or travel to our closest Caribbean neighbors of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, we have to do so through third countries. These countries represent a market of over 30 million people whose per capita income on products they consume are more aligned to Jamaica than to the countries we currently export to. Jamaica's logistical advantage creates natural opportunities to service these markets, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, the fact that our exports to the region amount only to 3% has more to do with us than it does with the CSME. Let us stop laying blame and giving ultimatums, Mr. Speaker. Let's lead. Focus on building our exports and breaking down the non-tariff barriers that currently exist, especially for agricultural produce and their value-added products, so that my farmer in Southeast can pick up and ship Jamaica's best ram goat meat to Trinidad and everywhere else in the world as a part of our strategic policy. Mr. Speaker, I believe our future lies in expanding CARICOM, not reducing it. Let us work on strengthening the region and while simultaneously strengthening our resolve at home. These two are not mutually exclusive goals. We must not use populist politics or cut off our noses to spite our faces, Mr. Prime Minister. Like it or not, Jamaica needs a restructured, effective CARICOM. So let us work on a new togetherness rather than walk backward into the future alone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister responsible for Agriculture, the manufacturing sector, fisheries, the distributive trade and investment promotion, that is, Mr. Speaker, practically the entire goods-producing sector of the economy. I rise to support the resolution now being debated. It is necessary to revisit, Mr. Speaker, the rationale and objectives of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to establish the CARICOM single market and economy, and indeed the report dealt extensively with that. Among the objectives of the revised treaty are improved standard of living and work in member countries, accelerated, coordinated, and sustained economic development, and organization for increased production and productivity. It is clear, therefore, that the overarching objective of the CSME is to increase our collective wealth and well-being through sustained economic growth derived from continuous increase in production and productivity. This goal has somewhat eluded us due to half-heartedness and sometimes a lack of commitment and an unevenness in the extent to which member states embrace the provisions of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to increase our common wealth. I remain convinced, Mr. Speaker, that the existing provisions of the revised treaty, if applied fairly and rigorously, can increase economic development in the region through increased trade among ourselves, supported by continuous production and productivity gains. Therefore, we need to commit ourselves first and foremost to applying the existing rules and strengthen where necessary to achieve the goal of a single market. The goal of a single economy is noble, but more challenging and will require tremendous political will to be achieved. It is instructive that even Europe, that has been at this for a much longer period, is challenged to achieve and maintain a single economy, as manifested in Brexit and the current political tension surrounding the issue of migration. Mr. Speaker, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas is a comprehensive document addressing a range of issues that will be addressed by various speakers in this debate today, and indeed has been addressed. Based on my portfolio responsibilities, I'll restrict myself to the issues related to trade in agriculture and manufactured goods. Mr. Speaker, one of the benefits of regional integration the world over is to increase the prosperity of all participants through unimpeded trade. Agriculture forms an important part of the economic and social fabric of most CARICOM states. In this regard, agreed mechanisms related to sanitary and phytosanitary issues are critical to facilitate trade in agricultural goods. In relation to trade generally, Jamaica has emerged, Mr. Speaker, as the single market that everyone wants to access. We have, however, experienced significant challenges in accessing the CARICOM market, largely on the grounds of SPS measures, phytosanitary measures. In this regard, I support the Commission's recommendation that calls for the removal of all non-tariff barriers and the establishment of agreed protocols for SPS measures. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Jamaica has achieved self-sufficiency in a number of agricultural goods, including chicken production, eggs, pork, and several vegetables and tubers. Any further expansion in our productive capacity of these goods will only be possible with access to near-shore preferential markets. Jamaica sees CARICOM as a natural extension of its domestic market, and we will be relentless and aggressive in pursuing this market, as we not only have the capacity to do so, but we have a right as enshrined in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. We must therefore accelerate every effort to have the necessary harmonized SPS measures in place as recommended by the Commission report. Mr. Speaker, it is inexplicable how quickly we move to establish SPS protocols between third countries and the CARICOM, while our requests to member states for access languish for years. Recall, for instance, the challenges we experienced in getting Jamaican patties into Trinidad, Barbados, and Belize. Juxtapose this against the volume of goods entering Jamaica from those markets. Jamaica alone cannot be the single market. Mr. Speaker, the manufacturing sector in CARICOM, apart from the processing of oil in Trinidad, is overwhelmingly agro-based. In fact, our collective manufacturing capacity far exceeds the current agricultural output to supply raw materials. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this mismatch should provide the perfect impetus to spur growth in agriculture. Again, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, through the provisions of the Common External Tariff and the Rules of Origin provisions, are intended to foster primary agricultural production to support manufacturing. This is precisely why the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas promotes trade in wholly produced primary goods and sets thresholds to ensure value addition and substantial transformation. Let me say that again. Substantial transformation or value added. Mr. Speaker, the practice has been a wholesale and liberal use of extra regional raw materials with little value addition to produce manufactured goods in the region and then ship them to the Jamaican market duty-free. Duty-free. All of this is happening when Jamaica itself has the capacity to produce some of these very raw materials, including peanuts, by the way. Mr. Speaker, I therefore call on CARICOM through the quoted to rigorously apply these rules, and the Attorney General has indicated how fragmented and difficult it appears to be able to apply those rules. Where countries demonstrate the capacity to produce the raw materials, the rules need to recognize this with adequate tariff protection and by lifting the threshold for transformation. For instance, Mr. Speaker, it is an affront to the peanut farmer in Jamaica not to be able to sell his peanuts when a manufacturing entity elsewhere in CARICOM can simply put a pretty package on extra regional peanuts and sell it to our market as a product of community origin duty-free. That's happening now. While we are expanding our dairy industry, provision has to be made within the rules to encourage this rather than simply importing extra regional milk, doing a little fortification, and then sell it into our market. Mr. Speaker, for the CSM to be effective and sustainable, it has to promote the development of primary industries. The Ministry is also responsible for a number of matters that facilitate investment, production, and trade, such as standardization, fair competition, consumer protection, rights of establishment, and the protection of intellectual property. Within the region, MICAF agencies have been model institutions in terms of developing the relevant legislation and institutional frameworks to promote investment, production, and trade. In this regard, Jamaica will continue to work with regional organizations to ensure that the issues are well ventilated and that we will implement where protocols and timelines have been agreed. So, Mr. Speaker, if the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas was fulfilling the objective of creating a CARICOM single market and economy that is fostering economic development and prosperity for all our people, we would not have needed a Golden Commission. From the perspective of the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries, we believe, however, that the existing treaty, if properly applied, can move us closer to a single market. We must have the courage to apply the provisions laid out in the treaty for monitoring and enforcement. We must also muster the political will to make changes where necessary, including those recommended by the Commission report, to promote the goal of a real and true single market. This must transcend mere political talk, and in that regard, I salute the definitive timelines articulated by the Golden Report. Time is not on our side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Mr. Bontin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start my presentation by associating myself with the earlier speakers in congratulating the Commission for the body of work. I think they've done a service. And I have to recognize that one of the members is my older brother, who has always tried to preach to me to not be as tribal as I am. And he says he supports all parties. He has voted for everyone. But I think it's a firm basis, including the India. I think that's a truly non-aligned family. No, and I would say much to the disappointment of my father, of my late father. However, let me say, I think we have a good basis, and I don't want to repeat much of what has been said, so I'll try and look at some of the clauses or the recommendations that have not been focused on up to now. And let me start by saying that it's not often that myself and the member from Northeast Manchester agree, but a lot of what he said there in terms of the rules of origin and those issues, I have no problem with supporting and agreeing that we need close enforcement for the single market and economy to work. I also must say I am sympathetic to the paragraph in the executive summary where the Commission says, but something cannot be said to have failed unless it has been tried. The single market and economy that we so often declare is not working cannot in reality be expected to work because it has not yet been functionally established. And therefore that leads, I understand, in the resolution to sections 3 and 4 where it emphasizes the importance of having a clear and definitive commitment to establish the single market with a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action. We don't go so far as to support 4, which speaks to a specific period of 3 to 5 years, which in a sense could be seen as just somewhat arbitrary, but I am sympathetic with the thrust that there needs to be some urgency for this implementation. But implementation deficit that the report speaks to is, in a sense, not unique to CARICOM. It perhaps is more representative of public sectors right across the region. And perhaps that makes it so much more important that we focus on recommendation 24, I believe, where it speaks to the necessity of allowing CARICOM nationals and corporate entities to avail themselves of the dispute settlement processes in their own right, rather than having to go through the public sector mechanisms. And similarly, where it speaks to the importance in recommendation 31 to take deliberate and strategic steps to engage the private sector at both national and regional levels, as the success of the CSME in particular ultimately depends on the private sector's involvement and efforts. And I think any initiative to bring them more closely into the implementation process, I think would be very useful and bring on board skills which are normally in short supply, implementation skills, project implementation skills, which are typically in short supply in the public sector. I want to just look a little bit on the recommendations related to CARICOM impacts, and that is 18 and 19, I believe, where the report calls for a review of impacts. Now, impacts is the implementing agency for crime and security. And having had some experience at CONSLE, the Council on National Security and Law Enforcement, there are some real challenges in getting a sort of standard established, just because of the wide variation in terms of size and professionalism in the various security forces. Some of the smaller countries don't even have an army, and therefore trying to get some synchronization, even in terms of things like intelligence fusion centers, where some countries use highly vetted units to conduct their interface with the fusion center, while others don't have that level of vetting, don't even have the capacity to do things like polygraph testing, etc. So there are some real challenges, and we have to figure out how to establish some standards in terms of the interface between these agencies, not just in terms of security, but in a lot of the common shared interfaces that require cooperation for the CARICOM single market and economy to truly work. I want to turn now to to really try and look at why has it been so difficult to get movement over the last few decades. And I think one of the issues, the real issues that we have to confront is that even within countries in the region, different parties have differing levels of commitment to CARICOM. And I think the integration fatigue has caused even the commitment within the individual parties to wax and wane from time to time. I do recall the experience of speaking with a colleague at one of our hemispheric meetings of defense and national security ministers, where there was a divide in CARICOM. And some ministers voted with UNASUR rather than CARICOM. And, comments were made that, boy, in terms of economic opportunity, UNASUR represents a much bigger potential block for them. Interestingly, UNASUR is having its own challenges. Now, I think this year something like 6 members have suspended their membership. But the value of a common market and economy is certainly much greater for the small players shipping goods to a relatively large market like Jamaica. But in services, and especially when we talk about the free movement of persons, a lot of that could reverse, and the advantages shift to the larger countries. So these things can balance out. But unfortunately, we seem to want to cherry pick the parts that suit us. For example, if we are a smaller country, you want to choose the free market. But in terms of the free movement, you want to opt out of that. And that is why I think we have not seen a total embrace. And I can speak to this not just as having as a politician interfaced on consular and other regional mechanisms, but even as a business person, where over 10 or 15 years we have had modest operations in the Eastern Caribbean. And the challenge there is not even so much the private sector and the nationals welcoming, but more so the public servants who seem to want to only allow the minimum, to do the minimum that they can to say they're in compliance. And I'll just give you one example. In the 2004 region, we opened a branch in Trinidad. And there had just been an agreement to abolish work permits for graduates of UWI. And we wanted to send one single Jamaican to that branch, which was overwhelmingly employing nationals. But even though a work permit was no longer required, the work permit exemption took longer than it used to take to get the work permit. So it really sort of made no sense. We thought we were moving forward, but in reality, the bureaucracy just frustrated the intention, which was to make that a fairly seamless and easy transfer of staff from one to the other. So I support the Section 7 of the resolution, which speaks of giving greater prominence to the role of the private sector in supporting the CSM objectives. I think that is a good thing, and I hope it can push things along. So I just want to close by saying that in trying to manage our place in a changing world, Jamaica needs some allies. CARICOM countries, by history and by culture, are perhaps our natural allies. As a group, we can band together around our shared values and principles, not just our individual interests, and defend the idea that there is more to politics than the rituals of domination and submission which we see playing out in international politics today. Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin, in fact, by joining my colleagues in congratulating the Prime Minister and the Chairman of the committee and the task force that was established to review CARICOM, the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding. I make the point of congratulating the Prime Minister because in my 30-odd years in this House, it's the first opportunity I believe we've had to take a deep and careful look at the provisions of the Treaty of Chaguaramas and indeed to examine in any fulsome way the political and economic construct that have guided the process of CARICOM over the years. And so I think that this is a great moment, in fact, for us because the House is participating in not just an analysis, but in also attempting to chart and create a new architecture into the future. I'm excited about that, Mr. Speaker, especially because I believe that the eminent group that met and deliberated and made recommendations were very well suited, very well appointed, and I think that they have created a body of information and ideas around which we can wrap our heads to look to the future to create this new architecture that we all want. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that because I am the Minister of Tourism, I know it is expected that I will speak to the critical subject because in discussing CARICOM and its future, we tend to look at the things that didn't work. And so we've been beating heavily, in fact, all afternoon on the things that didn't work. And what is it that worked? And is there anything that can work? And I think in time we have looked at the beginning with integration issues relating to the political process through federation. It didn't work. We've established a wonderful institution called the University of the West Indies. It worked greatly until it didn't work. Cricket has worked beautifully for a number of years until today we cry when we hear about West Indies cricket. It didn't work. And the culture of the region, we sought to bind ourselves around it, and we established CARIFESTA. And it went on for a season or two, and it didn't work. But you know, Mr. Speaker, there's one thing that has worked for the Caribbean over the years. And so, you know, we have sought to find ways and means to combat the urgent development challenges. And regionalism has been a strong and well-established and viable framework for promoting integration and cooperation in trade and other areas, and to enhance the region's competitiveness, deepen its integration into global economy, and address major social economic problems such as poverty and unemployment. A large market, Mr. Speaker, created by integration can promote economies of scale, sharing of economic costs and benefits, knowledge and skill transfer, and the pooling of resources to meet common goals effectively. Mr. Speaker, the search continues as we aim to find an economic nucleus through which integration can be ultimately achieved. And, Mr. Speaker, I think this brings tourism to the fore. Mr. Speaker, whether at the individual country level or collectively as a Caribbean, the economic contribution of tourism in the Caribbean is undeniable. Caribbean is a region of awesome peculiarities and features, which present both opportunities and constraints to its sustainable development, essentially within the context of globalization. Just to say that we are the most tourism-dependent region on earth. Just to say that of the 13 of us in CARICOM, 12 of us have tourism dependence of 10% and more. And in the case of a few of us, like Antigua and Barbuda, the dependence is 74.5%, second only to the Maldives that has a dependence of 79%. But the broader Caribbean, as we look at it, where 28 of us are in the archipelago, 16 of us have this high level of dependence on tourism. So it is fair to say, Mr. Speaker, that the common thread in economic terms that runs through the Caribbean is tourism. And therefore it forms the basis on which we can congeal around a series of policies and action to homogenize and to harmonize and to create areas of collaboration. That we can work together and build a common space that can be attractive to the world and bring more than the 30 million visitors who come last year and spent $29 billion. And so I believe that in the report that former Prime Minister Golding presented, I think recommendation 33 spoke about the removal of travel tax, and I think it spoke to a general releasing of the constraints for movement within the Caribbean area. And it also presupposed that that movement would create a level of dynamism in terms of intra-Caribbean movement, tourism. The effect of which would be to give great support to the international marketing efforts that we make by reducing to a large extent the dependence on external markets, because there is a very active flow of tourism activity between the islands of the Caribbean. In fact, in the case of Jamaica, the Caribbean represents the fourth largest market for us. So the fourth largest market is the Caribbean for us. So it speaks to the point that there's a lot of energy there that we can drive on. But Mr. Speaker, it calls for an ambition, a type of ambition that will drive a new architecture relating to how do we deal with borders and the free movement of people. And the essence of all of what tourism is the free movement of people. It speaks also to how do we look at policy alignment and policy coherence within this space to create a single Caribbean with multiple experiences and a marketing arrangement that will allow for multi-destination tourism. And multi-destination tourism means that the small islands can now be able to compete on a platform with the larger, because the essence is that we'll be able to bring traffic into the Caribbean space and then disperse that traffic throughout the Caribbean. But, Mr. Speaker, it also requires something else. It requires for us to recognize that the insularity that has characterized us over the years has to go. It means also that we have to look at ourselves not as little islands anymore, but as a Caribbean market. And as a Caribbean market, we have 33 million people. And we can broaden our appreciation of the geography by not confining ourselves to the Anglophone Caribbean, but also to look at the Francophone and the Spanish Caribbean and to look at a broader space. And even those countries that are being washed by the sea of the Great Caribbean Sea. So, Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity, I believe, for CARICOM to take another look at how it treats with tourism from the point of view of the demand that tourism brings into the Caribbean space for a level of supplies of goods and services which hitherto we are not able to deal with. For a destination which is highly tourism dependent and which ranks among the top 13 of the countries of the world in terms of that dependence, it is a horrible understanding that we are among the poorest. that we all are heavily debt-ridden, and that we have high unemployment rate, and that we also have issues with safety and security. So what then makes this tourism that is the mega industry of the world, which is the fastest growing in the world, 10% of global GDP, employ 12% of the world's employed persons, 33% in services in trade, and next to finance is the second largest contributor to global GDP. What makes that industry, with all that power, is causing poverty to be in a region where it has the highest dependence. The simple fact is, Mr. Speaker, that we have not built out the capacity to supply on the demand of tourism. And so what we wish that this new configuration that we hope to emerge from the Treaty of Chaguaramas and the understanding of a new CARICOM is to build out a new ambition to drive from this great tourism the real wealth that it has, and to have that wealth remain in the Caribbean. And so, in looking at how we produce goods, we need to, as I have often said, change the consumption and production patterns in the Caribbean. We need to produce more of the agricultural needs. We need to produce more of the manufactured goods. And we need to also own the experiences that the visitors consume when they get here. That ambition, Mr. Speaker, will drive the new wealth of the Caribbean. And it will enable us afterwards to see economic growth and the dream of transformation from poverty to prosperity. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
A convert for 30 years. A convert for 30 years.
Mr. Hilton. Mr. Speaker, I am privileged in many ways to be participating in this debate concerning the future of Jamaica's relations within the CARICOM and CARIFORUM framework. Mr. Speaker, this cornerstone relationship holds the promise of enabling Jamaica to realize its potential of becoming a global logistics hub and the fourth node in the global trading system. However, the most recent past has raised concerns about CARICOM's benefit to Jamaica's social and economic development and its continued role in the regional integration scheme. And for good reasons, Mr. Speaker. Jamaica's performance in CARICOM at this stage can only be described as an underachievement, notwithstanding its tremendous promise and expectation. So the question is, why? I'm privileged, Mr. Speaker, for other reasons. I believe I am correct in saying that with the retirement of former Prime Minister P.J. Patterson from this honourable House, I remain the only current member who have had an active role in shaping Jamaica's relations in CARICOM and CARIFORUM over the last 25 years. As such, Mr. Speaker, I have a particular responsibility to share my views on this critical question of Jamaica's continuing role in CARICOM and to express my views on what has come to be called the Golding Report, which is the subject of today's session of the Parliament. I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has late but indeed has presented the resolution, and although I will not speak to the resolution precisely because it was just moved today and presented today, I am pleased that it seeks to mobilize the debate around particular issues. And when we come to voting on the resolution, we may want to have a few comments on it before resolution is taken. Mr. Speaker, permit me a general observation before speaking on the specific findings and recommendations. This comment, Mr. Speaker, is born of my years of experience in negotiating the several intergovernmental trade arrangements in which Jamaica has been a participant over these last 25 years. It is simply this: words matter. Mr. Speaker, and indeed diplomacy has its place, no more so than when dealing with sovereign states, however large or small. I therefore view as particularly unhelpful what has been interpreted by some as a not-so-subtle threat or ultimatum to our CARICOM partners that unless a specific time-bound, measurable and verifiable action program to make the CARICOM single market and economy fully established and operational within the next 5 years, Jamaica should withdraw from CARICOM. There is, Mr. Speaker, a fine line between robust language designed to overcome inertia and the not-so-subtle threat of taking your marbles and withdrawing from the game. This is especially so in the context of our regional experience, in the failed federal experiment, and the now famous quote that 1 from 10 leaves 0. And I accept the point that we're talking about the CSM and not CARICOM as a whole. For reasons that I will more fully explain in this presentation, I am of the view that the ultimate recommendation in this report could prove unhelpful in the intergovernmental negotiations that the recommendation itself envisages. But, Mr. Speaker, this is not the sum total of my observation and comment on the work of the Commission. Because, Mr. Speaker, I do want to commend the Commission and its leadership, its membership, by the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding for the excellent work done in carrying out its wide-ranging consultations and for the thoroughness of its research and analysis, the insights it has shared with the stakeholders, and the boldness, if not correctness, of its recommendations, of which there are 33 such recommendations. While I do not agree with some of the recommendations made as more fully discussed in the presentation, I do share the view that the report is both timely and useful, and a useful reference source for helping to shape the positions of the several actors, including the government of Jamaica, in this continuing experiment that is the CARICOM and CARIFORUM arrangements. What then are the key findings of the report and my own comments? Mr. Speaker, following on the presentations of the various speakers, it is not my intention to comment on all important findings and recommendations contained in the report. In the interest of time, I will confine my comments to a select few, especially those highlighting the crucial role of the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ, in solving or at least attenuating the key problem diagnosed by the report as the main factor undermining the effectiveness of CARICOM, which is the implementation deficit. I first want to speak to Recommendation 25, which addresses whether domestic subsidies provided by a member state through the supply of energy are in violation of the CARICOM Treaty. Mr. Speaker, for reasons that will become obvious, I support the recommendation that this matter be pursued in the CCJ as a matter of urgency. I have previously argued and still believe that the resolution of this issue is of central importance to the proper functioning of the CSME, which is designed to deliver benefits to its member states on a fair and equitable basis. You may recall, Mr. Speaker, that as the then Minister of Mining and Energy, I brought this issue squarely to the fore in what I then argued for as Jamaica's energy dividend for its membership in the CSME arrangement. As a member of the Intergovernmental Task Force then negotiating the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and in particular the CSME arrangement, I considered that it was a fair price for Jamaica to access its, for a fair price for Jamaica to provide access to its market, the largest in the Caribbean, in the CARICOM then, in return for access to the key factors of production, mainly capital investments and energy. For Mr. Speaker, I said then, and I'm still of the view, that energy is as critical to production as water is to life. After all, Mr. Speaker, the entire objective of the CSME was to create a platform for efficient production and competitive cross-border trading in an expanded market as a means of ensuring our individual and collective viability as small economies in a liberalized and rapidly globalizing world. The key elements of the CSME are, of course, the free movement of the factors of production, namely goods and services, labor and capital, with the creation of a customs union established through the harmonized system of tariffs and secured by a common external tariff, the CET. I remain firm of the view that access to CARICOM energy resources on other than national treatment terms, as provided for in Articles 7 and 8 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, undermines the effectiveness of the treaty in meeting its objectives of a balance of rights and obligations, as well as benefits and burdens. More than that, Mr. Speaker, it would secure for those member states endowed with energy resources a structural advantage in the trading arrangements within the single market and economy, and render those countries, like Jamaica, which has no established reserve to date, at a structural disadvantage. Based on this view of the treaty, Mr. Speaker, the then Deputy Solicitor General, Professor Stephen Vassiani, and I were to file an action on behalf of the Government of Jamaica, using the good offices of the Secretary General of CARICOM, seeking declaratory relief on the basis that the issue of cross-border trading of energy resources and its byproducts fell within the terms of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. More specifically, Mr. Speaker, that the pricing of energy resources and energy products that discriminates against CARICOM nationals on the basis of nationality only is prohibited by the treaty. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the then General Counsel of CARICOM, now a member of the CCJ, Justice Winston Anderson, after reviewing the submissions from both governments, concluded that the issue falls within the scope of the revised treaty and that Jamaican nationals, whether as corporations or individuals, should be charged at the same rates as Trinidadians for the same or like products. Mr. Speaker, whether LNG or liquefied natural gas was the same or like product as natural gas was left to be decided by the CCJ, which was not yet established. The issue, Mr. Speaker, and the specific issue, this issue, Mr. Speaker, and the specific issue of subsidized energy as an input into manufacturing recommended by the report remains a key outstanding issue. The resolution of these allied issues are critical if a proper functioning of the for a proper functioning of the CSME. These issues are critical, and they're made all the more urgent due to the reported large finds of energy resources in Guyana and potentially elsewhere in CARICOM. Until then, Mr. Speaker, energy-rich countries within CARICOM will have a structural advantage in the cross-border trade in goods and services than the energy-poor ones. The question then is, what is the role for the CCJ in meeting the implementation challenges? As just indicated, Mr. Speaker, the issues of energy subsidies and the discriminatory pricing of energy and energy products within CARICOM remain major issues warranting the CCJ's determination. Yet the question must be asked, who will bell the cat? The question is pertinent, Mr. Speaker, because it is a fact that no member government of CARICOM has ever filed an action or claim against another member state, notwithstanding the several issues arising in the implementation or lack thereof of the treaty. None. Fortunately, in the absence of member governments initiating action, invoking the original jurisdiction of the CCJ, CARICOM nationals, both corporate and individual, have sought and utilized to good effects the limited private right of action enshrined in the treaty. In the process, the CCJ has had the opportunity to demonstrate its considerable sophistication, expertise, and erudition in delivering a quality of justice that has brought it commendation and helped to build confidence and trust in the institution. So that in the landmark case of Shanique Marion versus the Barbados government, a matter of which I have had more than a passing acquaintance, the CCJ demonstrated boldness of action and courage in ordering the government of Barbados to change its immigration practices and procedures, zealously guarded by states as a symbol of their sovereignty. On the way to its decision, the court made path-breaking rulings, none more important than its ruling that heads of government decisions taken at its conferences are binding on member states and must be implemented in its domestic laws. Mr. Speaker, these are bold and far-reaching rulings by a court that is clear as to the central objective of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas and confident in its interpretation and application of international norms that can withstand scrutiny from commentators, legal luminaries, and judges in other well-regarded courts, both regionally and internationally. The question remains, Mr. Speaker, in light of the increased confidence and growing plaudits and accolades being heaped on the CCJ, why has not one government member initiated an action against another member government before the court in order to address the well-known implementation deficit? I think that's a pertinent question. Mr. Speaker, not even to seek a declaratory or advisory opinion on a matter of treaty interpretation or application in the process of implementing the CSME, not even to seek guidance from the court where difficulties and challenges have arisen. They have simply done nothing. Mr. Speaker, if this reality speaks to the lack of political will on the part of member governments, even to seek guidance from the court, what is the excuse for private businesses and individuals whose interests are being directly and adversely affected? Mr. Speaker, the point is abundantly clear that the CCJ, in its original jurisdiction has a critical role in assisting with the implementation deficit being experienced in the integration efforts in CARICOM. It is my considered view that the report gives too short a shrift to the fundamental role of the CCJ in aiding in the implementation process and thereby overemphasizes the role for the intergovernmental task forces in negotiating parts of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas without first, listen up, Madam Director, Solicitor General, Attorney General, without first having the court's interpretation of member states' balance of rights and obligations, as well as benefits and burdens under the existing revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Mr. Speaker, commenting briefly on recommendation 23, I would urge caution in seeking to, quote, restructure the existing dispute settlement arrangements by establishing a central dispute settlement body similar to that which exists in the WTO. I agree with it. First off, I must remind that the existing arrangements were designed to achieve specific outcomes, such as uniformity of decision-making and laws. By giving the CCJ exclusive and compulsory jurisdiction concerning disputes among contracting parties, with the community organs, community nationals who are given special leave, and referrals of issues concerning the revised treaty from national courts. Also, Mr. Speaker, at this stage of the development of a new species of law called community law, it was thought important to give primacy to the precedential value of decisions made by the CCJ, rather than by arbitration, mediation, etc., which are the private arrangements between the parties with no binding precedent in similar disputes. Additionally, WTO remedy in trade disputes are applied prospectively, and therefore limits the scope of remedies available to the tribunal. In contrast, the CCJ can and have granted injunctive relief, pecuniary damages, and awarded costs to the successful parties. This was thought important in order to incentivize the private companies and individuals to bring suits against offending parties and thus enforce the treaty provisions. Regarding recommendation 24, I will simply add to my comments on number 23 that the limited private right of action in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas has been interpreted by the CCJ in an expansive manner as to ground jurisdiction in cases brought before it by private companies and individuals, once there is clear evidence that the rights granted by the treaty has been infringed. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I return to recommendation number 33, this time to make my substantive comments. The point is already made in this presentation, but bears repeating that the simultaneous use of the court alongside the Intergovernmental Task Force for negotiating reforms of the treaty is perhaps the most practical and balanced approach to making changes to the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Mr. Speaker, unless resort is had to the advisory and/or declaratory functions of the CCJ, the proposal that key structural issues of governance, accountability, as well as key issues influencing the establishment of the single market and economy are not likely to happen, if at all. Not likely to happen overnight, if at all. Repeat. Unless resort is had to the advisory and declaratory functions of the CCJ, the proposal that key structural issues of governance, accountability, as well as key issues influencing the single market and economy are not likely to happen overnight, if at all. Indeed, the 5-year period for some issues to be addressed, as have been said by the Leader of Opposition and others, seems arbitrary and is just too short a time based on past experiences. Therefore, shorter time, 5 years, is arbitrary. Therefore, it is highly likely that the arbitrary 5-year period will expire without the chance of broad-based and meaningful change occurring. The recommendation that Jamaica withdraws from the treaty, which I've seen the Prime Minister has attenuated, and assumes a position similar to the Bahamas. The Bahamas' position in CARICOM. And only then, Mr. Speaker, consider alternative trade arrangement with CARICOM. First point to note, Mr. Speaker, is that Jamaica and the Bahamas are similar in some ways, as the Minister of Tourism pointed out, but are quite different in other ways. They are both tourism countries, relying heavily on the revenues from tourism to engender development and growth. There, the similarities end. The Bahamas lacks an industrial and manufacturing as well as an agricultural base, and therefore produces very little of what the population consumes. The benefit of a CET to the Bahamas would be of little or no value. That is why the Bahamas stayed out and did not join the single market arrangement, because it saw no real benefit in the common external tariff, only disadvantages. Mr. Speaker, should Jamaica withdraw from the CSME, it would probably lose its status within the Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, or at least be sidelined, which is aimed, let me repeat, Prime Minister, you need to listen very carefully, which is aimed at deepening regional integration among CARIFORUM states, which is the CARICOM plus the Dominican Republic and Cuba. All that would be available to Jamaica, all that would be available to Jamaica would be the general system of preferences, the GSP scheme, which is non-contractual, meaning that there is no binding agreement and is merely offered by developed countries on a bilateral basis. The conditions surrounding GSP schemes are therefore subject to change unilaterally. This is not a basis on which investors make their long-term capital investment, Mr. Speaker. They don't. They want certainty and contractual arrangements. Also, Mr. Speaker, the Logistic Hub Initiative, lately embraced by the administration as a national priority program, presupposes the availability of expanded market access in CARIFORUM, EPA, Cuba, and countries in South and Central America, certainly not a reduced and reducing market access. But, Mr. Speaker, a Jexit for CARICOM would learn the same lesson as Brexit, which is that there is a divorce fee to pay. At a minimum, Jamaica would forfeit its payment to the CCJ and may well have to continue paying fees to some organizations or organs in CARICOM. And I would suggest that a word to the wise. The simple fact, Mr. Speaker, is that the Jamaican market is not attractive enough, either in CARICOM or standing alone. Neither do we have the capacity to undertake several bilateral or multilateral agreements simultaneously or serially. Mr. Speaker, if we were not attractive to the Canadians within CARICOM, why would Canada, for example, negotiate with Jamaica alone? Why? The lesson, Mr. Speaker, that may help, that may be an incentive. The lesson, Mr. Speaker, is it is always better to expand market access from a position of greater market access and not from a shrinking market access. It has often been said that while CARICOM is necessary, it is not sufficient. Often been said, recognized. In an increasing globalizing world and in the logistics-centered economy that we aspire to, ever-increasing market access is needed, not less. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica should commit to continuing to provide the leadership within CARICOM as a basis for increasing its market access through negotiating more beneficial trading agreements. And if we want to attract more investors into the designated special economic zones, or SEZs, to be implemented, only through properly negotiated and enforced agreements can we assure our investors, local and foreign, of increasing market access, not through generalized systems of preferences, which are non-contractual. Mr. Speaker, let us learn the lessons of Brexit. Let us start to enforce our treaty rights under the existing CARICOM-CARIFORUM arrangements, and we'll see Jamaica and the CARICOM thrive. Thank you.
Dr. Tufton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being the night watchman, Mr. Speaker, there are very few original shots that can be displayed at this point in time. All is left for me to do, therefore, for the most part anyway, is to endorse what has been said and be brief about it, Mr. Speaker, in anticipation of lights declaring the end of the session this evening. Bad light, of course. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by commending the administration of the day and in particular the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister for having the vision and the foresight to advance this particular study on CARICOM. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's important, and I want to make the point because I have listened and I believe the discussion on both sides have been quite constructive, and I think the approach, the attitude, and there's a lot of sincerity in seeing CARICOM work for us as a country, work for us as a region, and I want to commend all involved. But for a very long time, there has been this perception, and I had to confront it when I sat in the upper house on that side, that only one political entity in the country had an affinity to, an emotional attachment to, a commitment to the regional collaboration, cooperation, and integration movement. And periodically, even in the discussion here, Mr. Speaker, tonight, I have heard insinuations, if not explicitly, implicit suggestion that that commitment remains only in certain quarters and not in others. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, on this side, that this requirement or request by the Honorable Prime Minister early in the days of the administration for this report is a demonstration of the commitment on this side to working with our Caribbean partners and CARICOM in particular. And I want to place that on the record in reinforcing our own commitment and debunking that perception that existed for a long time that we are not pro-region and pro-supportive of the critical mandate of the region. Mr. Speaker, I endorse what has been said about the benefits of Caribbean cooperation and CARICOM as an entity. The reality is that we have challenges, we have opportunities that are similar in nature by virtue of where we are, geographic space, the makeup of our population, the fact that we are exposed to the similar vulnerabilities, whether it's natural or man-made, and as a consequence, and operating in a world that requires collaboration, we have to commit to ensuring, in the first instance, that we find ways to improve and enhance the CARICOM arrangement, the regional arrangement. In fact, one of the points I support in the report, which I think could have been elaborated on more, is the extent to which, in recognizing the similar challenges and the potential for opportunities that we have in the region, that we are not placing even greater emphasis and focus on expanding that regional integration movement beyond the existing membership of CARICOM. I do believe that that is one area of focus and emphasis which could bring even greater benefits once we overcome the challenges that we face and the report mentions. Mr. Speaker, oftentimes we use tangible trade arrangements and the statistics associated with that to determine whether or not CARICOM has served us well, and Jamaica in particular. And the common discussion around ourselves versus a Trinidad as a major trading partner and the deficits that exist between us, the trade gaps in their favor. Very often though, Mr. Speaker, and the report speaks to this, and I think it's worthy of repetition, the extent to which CARICOM plays an important role as it relates to people exchange. And from Jamaica's perspective, the very conservative estimate is that we have well over 30 to 40,000 Jamaicans who are deployed. I think Trinidad alone has close to 20,000, who are deployed in the CARICOM space in respective territories, islands, who are playing significantly important roles, both in a professional capacity, skilled and unskilled, and indeed bringing significant benefits to those jurisdictions and, by extension, providing an opportunity for them and for their dependents here in Jamaica. And if we were to assess not just the tangibles, but the intangibles in terms of services, I believe the perspective, the importance of CARICOM to Jamaica would be greatly amplified. And I think that is one of the areas I think that the report allows us an opportunity to examine and to emphasize, and hopefully will renew our commitment to expanding the relationships that we have, despite the challenges. Oftentimes, we identify the individual isolated cases as cases that we need to address, but oftentimes in highlighting those cases, we overlook the many others who benefit by the exchange of professional effort or unskilled effort within the region. Mr. Speaker, the challenge we face, and again, it has been mentioned by several of the speakers, I say it only for emphasis, is the extent to which we state noble objectives, noble commitments, and we have a deficit in terms of the implementation. And I believe almost every speaker who that spoke before me mentioned the implementation deficit. And I think the report addresses that and provides an important basis on which we should recommit ourselves, but recommit ourselves in a manner that assesses periodically through monitoring and evaluation our deliverables and align those deliverables to the commitment that we made. And I think in that respect, there's a lot of value from the report in supporting a more rules-based arrangement in getting things done, not just talking about them, but getting it done. And again, on both sides, we have emphasized that. But I want to, in that context, mention what I consider to be a possible challenge that we face within CARICOM. And that is our motivation, based on the current arrangement, the current structure, to almost attempt to be all things to all men. In other words, the agenda of CARICOM and the role that it plays and the role that is required of it by member states, and I assume by those who are pressuring the leadership of member states, the people, sometimes waters down the effectiveness of CARICOM to work as a team, in that it becomes extremely difficult for decisions to be made around a common cause, and those decisions to manifest themselves in implementable initiatives. In other words, Mr. Speaker, in my own view, I've always felt that CARICOM has to redefine its role and truly spend time and effort in assessing the areas of emphasis and focus that truly brings benefit to all, and therefore improve the chances of getting a commitment from all member states towards achieving and implementing those benefits. Now, I've identified a few that I think are impatient of debate. The areas of education and training. Clearly, we have a history there with the University of the West Indies, with extended education, offshore education institutions, a big area that no one within the region can debate or argue over in terms of whether or not it doesn't benefit each member state. In the area of regional security, we are right in the middle, Mr. Speaker, of countries that supply, practice illicit trade in narcotics or guns, and countries that supply, that demand. And we have gotten caught right in the middle, Mr. Speaker, and as a consequence, it has been a serious risk. There is common purpose in us working together as a team to address those issues. The risks from natural disasters, Mr. Speaker, international lobbying, a very important area. We are, in our own right, a sovereign state, and therefore in the international arena, we are entitled to vote and to influence the international agenda. Together as a group, if we agree on those causes, we could carry significant weight in a number of areas. In the area of healthcare, Mr. Speaker, my particular portfolio where I want to spend a little time, the challenge of health begs collaboration within the region. And in a sense, we are confronted by very similar challenges. And the solution becomes that much more difficult if we attempt to confront these challenges as individual member states, as opposed to a collaborative effort by the group. And I want to just mention one or two specific examples in supporting the report and the main thrust of the report to strengthen that collaboration through establishing particular rules, monitoring, and evaluation. Mr. Speaker, in the area of communicable diseases, the biggest threat that we face clearly is the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti in particular. And that vector has wreaked havoc on the people of the Caribbean. And Jamaica's experience, my colleague across from me who was Minister of Health, well, both colleagues, appreciates, I think, more than anybody else, the extent to which that challenge has been a significant challenge for us as a population. Now, let's take ZIKV as a case in point. ZIKV is named after the Zika forest in Africa. That's where that particular disease started. It is said that the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, interacted with monkeys in the desert, in the forest of Africa, the Zika forest. ZIKV was created, and it has traveled from there through the Caribbean, and once it touched down in one island because of trade and movement, then we are all basically vulnerable. And we have seen the manifestations of that. And I could use several other such other examples to demonstrate those vulnerabilities. It therefore, Mr. Speaker, requires of us, if we are to confront this challenge and challenges of this sort, a collaborative effort. Now, CARICOM makes provisions for that through CARFA, through other agencies, and indeed here in Jamaica, because we are one of the larger islands, we have gone ahead and done even more through the establishment of the Mosquito Research and Control Unit in collaboration with the University of the West Indies, in collaboration with CARFA, in collaboration with bilateral agencies like the USAID, and are now embarked, Mr. Speaker, on a group effort, a collaborative effort, to tackle a problem which represents a risk to all of us. Mr. Speaker, there is no clearer indication, certainly from a public health perspective, that we need that collaborative effort in order to deal with the risks that we are exposed to, certainly in public health. If you look at the health profile of the region, Mr. Speaker, obesity levels are perhaps some of the highest levels in the world. This region and the impact of obesity on NCDs. Mr. Speaker, our profile is similar, our lifestyle is similar, the environment is similar, and as a consequence, we are similarly exposed and at risk in these cases. Therefore, it requires, Mr. Speaker, a regional response. I go further. In negotiating, Mr. Speaker, areas of opportunities in public health, and I want to touch on a subject that my colleague, newly minted Minister of Agriculture, is particularly excited about from an investment perspective, and that is marijuana or ganja. Mr. Speaker, in the international arena, marijuana, meaning at the level of WHO, is classified as a type A narcotic, meaning it's seen as an illegal substance. And as a consequence, Mr. Speaker, some of the opportunities that we in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, with the advantages that we have with the cultural practices that provide some of these opportunities, the recognition globally in terms of our rules of origin and so on, cannot be exploited unless we take advantage of a regional approach in this particular international arena to influence a change in that position as it relates to this particular product. And I am happy to say that in this regard, the CARICOM Ministers of Health have taken a decision and have advanced a position in the halls of the WHO to get marijuana reclassified from a type A narcotic to a raw material input to support medicinal solutions for the population and for the world. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, indeed, since that presentation was made last year, a few months ago, we were contacted by the WHO, the World Health Organization's expert committee, the committee that considers these recommendations or submissions, that this particular issue is now being taken up by them and will be placed under active consideration, which, Mr. Speaker, means we have pioneered an approach to get what is a natural advantage in public health to be mainstreamed. And, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica alone would have had a chance, but Jamaica, with all the other Caribbean territories, seeing similar benefits, has a much greater chance to achieve this particular objective. Another one, Mr. Speaker, quickly, in public health, and this is linked now to human resource capacity. We benefit from each other through the exchange of HR capacity. But at the same time, we are at risk to the rest of the world in particular areas of human resource capacity. And in public health, that risk is perhaps greatest, in that we lose, in particular, our healthcare professionals, our specialist nurses, to the international marketplace, in particular North America, whether Canada or the US and the UK. And this has been an ongoing problem. Mr. Speaker, we took this challenge, Jamaica, supported by its Caribbean colleagues, to the WHO again, and made a very strong case to highlight the nature of the problem, the international practices which runs contrary to ILO rules, not enforceable rules, but rules of conduct as it relates to international recruitment of professionals, where shortages exist and where it places the country that you're recruiting from under undue hardships, We took that case to the international community and got a well-received listening ear from the WHO to the extent where a communique was issued around this particular issue. We did better than that. We advanced an approach towards bilateral cooperation, where the typically recruiting country would support the country losing that human resource capacity to advance additional training. And you would have heard in the sectoral presentation where we have been successful at doing that. The Caribbean region, again, Mr. Speaker, was critical to that, in that while one country may have advanced it, we got significant support from the region in this regard. So, Mr. Speaker, from a public health perspective, there are significant advantages to sharpening up and strengthening the regional approach and regional collaboration in support of mutual benefits. But that focus, as I said earlier, has to be sharper. Mr. Speaker, I certainly support the report's recommendation dealing with research and innovation and collaboration between the private sector, the University of the West Indies, and other stakeholders. In public health, you cannot do it on your own. You have to collaborate, you have to establish partnerships, not just in country, but between countries, not just in region, but between regions. But you are stronger as a team when you work together. And again, we have seen significant examples of that. Importantly, though, I think a common thread that has emanated the discussions here tonight is the issue around the implementation deficit. And so, to my mind, one of the stronger recommendations in the report, which I certainly endorse, is the recommendation for performance criteria to be established with 3-year assessment to support accountability of commitments that are made. And the speakers all spoke to that, Mr. Speaker. It is something that I certainly endorse. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, as the second to last night watchman, and I'm setting the example for the other night watchman to come, since I've been only here at 5 minutes, I want to say that this report, and I want to commend former Prime Minister Golden and the team, the Honorable Prime Minister, for advancing, those who accepted and have done the work. This report places on the agenda an important subject. It renews and advances a commitment to a cause. And we shouldn't get carried away with that final recommendation about withdrawal, because, you know, when you have options, options range from one extreme to the next. It doesn't mean that you're going to exercise every single option that is there. And that was never the intent of the report that was submitted. The report gave options for consideration. And I'm here to say, certainly from a public health perspective, the report is timely, the report was necessary, and the report certainly shows leadership on the part of the administration to advance a discussion which hopefully will lead to a better region. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Guy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on the resolution which deals with the report of the Commission to review Jamaica's relations within CARICOM and CARIFORM framework as presented to the government in March 2017 and laid in Parliament this year. In April 2017, speaking then as opposition spokesman on foreign affairs and foreign trade, Mr. Speaker, I questioned the delay in the tabling of this report in the Parliament. Today, we are now having this very important debate. Again, as I did last year, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the chairman and his team for putting together this report worthy of discussions, introspection, and more importantly, of proposed actions, though not necessarily agreeing with all its recommendations. First, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, I support CARICOM and its stated intention based on the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in 2001, with all its intent in having a Caribbean single market and economy. Whilst it is recognized, Mr. Speaker, that the 15 member states of CARICOM may have their own agendas and have a tinge of insularity, there's more that binds us together as a grouping than separates us. It may be an idealistic position, Mr. Speaker, but like similar agglomeration of countries in any economic unions, they are not perfect, and indeed may be termed works in progress. However, for these unions to work to the benefit of all states, the Secretariat has to be functioning optimally. This engine room of the economic union has not been living up to its mandate. The report encapsulates this in Section 7, where it speaks to the strengthening of the powers and capacity of the Secretariat with an ability to provide member states in the implementation of CARICOM decisions and fulfillment of treaty requirements, especially in drafting, training, and it goes on. But even more poignant is the comments relating to the limited powers of the Secretariat, and that the implementation deficits are primarily due to national governments over which the Secretariat has no authority, or may, with whatever power they have not used it. Mr. Speaker, it is evident that part of the lackluster view of and indifference to CARICOM is due to the ineffectiveness of the Secretariat. People don't hear from the Secretariat. The majority of our 18 million people don't even know of the Secretariat and what it does. I suspect even CARICOM member states are asking the same question. But perhaps the year-end report, which has gained much attention for me, Mr. Speaker, on which my presentation will be primarily on, is shown in Recommendation 26, which reads, Review and procedures of foreign policy consultation and coordination in order to avoid, as far as possible, the types of conflicting and embarrassing positions that have emerged from time to time among CARICOM members, depriving it of the collective force it is capable of exerting. Many speakers before, Mr. Speaker, have spoken to that in different ways. But no other time is that statement more profound as it is now, Mr. Speaker. And very recent events have suggested that CARICOM has become more of a motley crew when coordinated foreign policy is concerned. Many times we have been embarrassed by positions taken by national governments as they have defied logic as well as those intentions of reason and principle. Traditionally, CARICOM has voted in international fora such as United Nations on various issues as a bloc. CARICOM has sought to support a candidacy for international organizations as a united force, and where it is usually looked to for intention and guidance by other countries. Now take the recent Jerusalem vote, Mr. Speaker. CARICOM was all over the place. 7 voted to support the resolution, whilst 5, including Jamaica, abstained. This created widespread condemnation by citizens of many countries, including here in Jamaica. At the OS, our record as an integration union has not been encouraging. We have meandered on many important issues. This was not always so. Mr. Speaker. In fact, in an article by Sir Ronald Sanders in the Observer of June 4, 2017, on the OS meeting of May 31st, 2017 states, and I quote, contrary to all who dismissed it as impossible, the 14 independent member states of the Caribbean community displayed strong solidarity at the OS on Wednesday, May 31st, 2017. In doing so, the CARICOM countries show the soft power that they can wield in hemispheric stage where they maintain solidarity and unity of purpose. It was a moment, he quoted, of unbridled CARICOM pride. This demonstrates what is capable of being achieved when we are united in our approach. A quote from an article in the Inter-American Dialogue of June 19, 2017 states, "The structure of the OAS voting system gives Caribbean countries significant power. Thanks to the one country, one vote, the OAS is one of the few venues where these small countries, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, can play a decisive role on the world stage. The Caribbean smartly recognize their power is strongest when they act as a unit, which will make it hard to peel off individual countries," unquote. However, Mr. Speaker, that position was preceded by another position taken at the Permanent Council of the OAS in April 27, when incidentally the vote for convening the May meeting was taken. Quoting from an Observer article of April 29, 2017, when headlines screamed, "Caribbean countries divided on situation in Venezuela." And it says, "Caribbean countries appear divided on the need to discuss the ongoing political situation in Venezuela, even as the Permanent Council of the OAS approved a resolution to convene a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of the region to consider the situation in that country." The vote was evenly split among CARICOM member states, 5 for and 5 against. Again, Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, in June 6, 2018, this very month, our position was just as divisive. Quoting from a Caribbean publication, "Caribbean community countries were split yesterday when the OAS voted to pass a resolution that can initiate the process of Venezuela's suspension from the organization. The General Assembly voted with 19 member states in favor, including us, 4 against. 4 against, including Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Belize, Grenada, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Suriname, and Trinidad, among 11 abstaining. This, Mr. Speaker, this non-unified approach took a turn for showing what you were wearing when a public spat erupted in the media between 2 heads of government on the matter of Venezuela and the position of the OAS. I need not elaborate on that, but this just demonstrates and supports the recommendation highlighted in recommendation number 26. The CARICOM report went on further, Mr. Speaker. It states, "The capacity of member states to negotiate globally is strengthened by their membership in CARICOM as a regional bloc. CARICOM constitutes 14 votes in important international and regional bodies such as the UN, 7%, the Commonwealth, 27%, ILO, 7%, OAS, 40%, and it went on. This gives CARICOM states, when acting in concert, a leverage proportionately greater in terms of its combined population than any other region in the world," unquote. This has been particularly effective